In 1962, a grandmother in Greenville, Mississippi, fed 14 people every Sunday after church for 23 years. She never once opened a cookbook. She cooked by feel, by the weight of flour in her palm and the color of oil in a cast iron skillet. Her hands knew things no recipe card could hold. That knowledge is number 4 on this list. Number 18 disappeared because the woman who made it passed in 1994 and nobody watched her closely enough. Number 9 required a technique so specific that 3 granddaughters tried to recreate it and never got it right. Now, this is not a history lesson, and I'm not telling you to change how you eat. This is just looking at how things used to be when Sunday meant something sacred. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count down 25 Sunday dinners Black grandmothers made without a recipe. Number 25, smothered pork chops. Back then, this was the dish that told the whole neighborhood you had a grandmother who knew what she was doing. A woman in Monroe, Louisiana, started these pork chops at 7 in the morning, right after she pressed her church dress. She seasoned thick bone-in chops with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and a pinch of something she would never name. She dredged them in flour and fried them golden in a cast iron skillet that had been in her family since 1931. Then she scraped the bottom of that pan, added sliced onions and water, and covered those chops until the gravy turned the color of dark honey. She never measured the flour. She never timed the simmer. She said the chops would tell you when they were done by the way the meat pulled from the bone. Her granddaughter asked for the recipe in 2003 and got a 3-word answer. Season it right. That was the entire recipe. Number 24, candied yams. In the Black Sunday dinner tradition, candied yams were not a side dish. They were a declaration. A woman in Birmingham, Alabama, peeled sweet potatoes with a paring knife so old the handle had been wrapped in electrical tape twice. She sliced them thick, layered them in a baking dish with butter, brown sugar, and a pour of vanilla she eyeballed from the bottle. No measuring spoons, no recipe, just decades of knowing how much sweet was enough. The yams went into the oven before church and came out when the sermon was over, bubbling in a syrup so thick you could hold a spoon upright in it. Some women added orange juice, others added nutmeg. The variations were as individual as the women who made them, and every version was correct because there was no written original to argue against. And by the early 2000s, most families had switched to canned yams from a grocery store. The slow-peeled, hand-sugared version faded out of your reach. Number 23, collard greens. If you walked into a Black kitchen on a Sunday morning and did not smell greens simmering with the smoked ham hock, something was wrong. Collard greens were the backbone of the Sunday table, and the recipe existed only in the hands of the woman stirring the pot. She started with the ham hock, dropped into a deep pot of water. She added vinegar, whichever bottle she grabbed first. She tore the collard leaves off the stems by hand, washed them 3 times in cold water, and packed them into the pot so tightly the lid barely closed. Then she cooked them low and slow for 3 hours until the leaves turned silky and the potlikker at the bottom became the richest broth you ever tasted. The seasoning was salt, pepper, a little sugar to cut the bitterness, and whatever else her mother's hands had taught her. No 2 women made their greens the same way, and if you asked which version was best, you would start an argument that still has not been settled. Number 22, baked macaroni and cheese. This wasn't the kind from a blue box. This was a Sunday production. A woman in Atlanta mixed elbow macaroni with 3 or 4 kinds of cheese, eggs, evaporated milk, butter, and a seasoning blend she kept in an unmarked jar. She poured it into a casserole dish and baked it until the top turned golden and the edges got crispy enough to snap. The middle stayed creamy and soft. The secret, she said, was in knowing when to pull it from the oven, not by a timer, but by the color of the crust. According to food historians, James Hemings, an enslaved chef who trained in France, brought macaroni and cheese to American tables in the 1700s, and 200 years later, Black women had perfected it into something that had everything to do with a kitchen full of family waiting for Sunday dinner. The recipe was never written down because it changed every time. A little more cheese one week, a little less milk the next. If you asked her how much of each, she couldn't tell you. She adjusted by feel, and it was never wrong. Number 21, fried chicken. Every woman had her own fried chicken, and no two batches tasted alike. A woman in Memphis kept her seasoning mix in a coffee can on top of the refrigerator. She soaked the chicken in buttermilk overnight and dredged each piece through seasoned flour, measured by the shake of her wrist and nothing else. The skillet's oil had to be exactly the right temperature, and she tested it by dropping a pinch of flour into the grease. If it sizzled and floated, the oil was ready. No thermometer, no timer. She stood at that stove and turned each piece exactly once, and she knew it was done by the sound of the sizzle, not by any clock on the wall. If you have ever walked into a kitchen where fried chicken was cooling on the counter wrapped in foil, you know what Sunday smelled like. That smell was the whole sermon. Here is what made her timing right. Every pan was different. Every batch of oil was different. She compensated without thinking about it. Number 20, cornbread dressing. This was the dish that caused family arguments at Thanksgiving, but it appeared on Sunday tables all through the fall and winter. A woman in Macon, Georgia, made cornbread a day ahead, crumbled it by hand, and mixed it with celery, onion, sage, boiled eggs, and chicken broth from scratch. The proportion of bread to broth was the whole secret, and she knew it by the feel of the mixture in her hands. Too dry and it crumbled on your plate. Too wet and it turned to mush. She squeezed a handful, and if it held together but still felt light, the ratio was right. No recipe could teach you that. It was knowledge that lived in a woman's fingers, passed from mother to daughter by standing side by side in the kitchen. The sage was the signature. Too much, and it tasted like medicine. Too little, and it tasted like wet bread. Her amount was perfect, and she could not have told you what it was. Number 19, sweet potato pie. In the Black community, sweet potato pie was not just a dessert, it was almost sacred. A woman in Charleston, South Carolina, roasted her sweet potatoes until the skin split and the sugars caramelized inside. She scooped the flesh into a bowl, added butter, sugar, vanilla, cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pour of evaporated milk that she measured by counting to 3 while tilting the can. That was her measuring system, a 3-count pour. She mixed everything by hand, poured it into a pie crust she had rolled on a flour-dusted counter, and baked it until the filling set. Sweet potatoes came to American kitchens through West Africa, where yams had been a staple for generations. Enslaved cooks adapted what they knew to what was available, and sweet potato pie became a cornerstone of Black celebration. Church dinners, funerals, baptisms, family reunions. It appeared at every gathering because it carried the taste of home with it. Number 18, peach cobbler. This was the dish that disappeared when Ernestine Walker of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, passed in 1994. She made her cobbler with fresh peaches from a tree in her backyard, peeled by hand at the kitchen sink in an apron she had sewn herself. She sliced the peaches into a baking dish, scattered sugar, cinnamon, and a squeeze of lemon over them, then dropped spoonfuls of batter on top that spread and rose in the oven into a golden crust. The batter was flour, sugar, milk, and melted butter mixed with a fork. She didn't measure any of it. She said the batter should look like thick pancake mix and the peaches should be sweet enough to eat raw before you add a single grain of sugar. 4 grandchildren tried to recreate it after she died. None of them could. The recipe lived in her hands, and her hands were gone. Have you ever tried to write down a recipe that exists only in someone's hands? Here is what nobody talks about when we celebrate soul food. When one of these women died, the recipe died with her. Not because she was selfish, not because she was secretive, because cooking by feel cannot be written down. You cannot put a 3-count pour of evaporated milk on an index card. You cannot describe the exact color of oil that means the skillet is ready. These women carried entire libraries of knowledge in their muscle memory, and when they were gone, those libraries closed forever. You are left with a taste you remember and a dish you cannot reproduce. That is the real cost of cooking without a recipe. The food was perfect, and it was temporary. Number 17, banana pudding. If you grew up going to church suppers, you know this dessert. Every woman brought one, and every child fought over it. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi, layered vanilla wafers, sliced bananas, and a custard she made from scratch on the stovetop. She cooked milk, sugar, egg yolks, and a spoonful of flour in a saucepan, stirring until the mixture thickened enough to coat a spoon's back. She spread meringue on top and browned it under the broiler for exactly as long as it took her to walk to the front porch and back. That was her timer, a walk to the porch. Banana pudding traveled through the Great Migration as millions of Black Americans carried their recipes north. By the 1960s, it was a fixture at church suppers from Chicago to Detroit to Philadelphia. The homemade custard version started disappearing in the 1980s when instant pudding mix became cheaper and faster. The women who still made it from scratch became fewer every year. Number 16, oxtail stew. Oxtails were the cheapest cut at the butcher counter for decades, often less than 50 cents a pound because most people did not know what to do with them. Black women who cooked Sunday dinner did. A woman in Savannah, Georgia, seasoned oxtail pieces with salt, pepper, garlic, and onion powder, then browned them in a heavy pot until the outside was dark and caramelized. She added water, onions, carrots, and potatoes, then let the whole thing simmer for 4 hours while the family was at church. By the time everyone came home, the meat was falling off the bone and the broth had turned into a thick, rich gravy. Oxtails were a staple of Sunday dinner in Black households because they were cheap and they rewarded patience. You could not rush them. You could not shortcut them. You had to give them time, and in return, they gave your table one of the most deeply flavored meals any kitchen ever produced. Today, oxtails cost $8 to $12 a pound. The women who made them affordable are gone. Number 15, neck bones and gravy. During slavery, enslaved people were given the cuts of meat that slaveholders did not want. Neck bones were among them. Black cooks transformed these bony, tough pieces into a meal by simmering them for hours with onions, garlic, and water until the meat turned tender and the broth thickened into a dark, velvety gravy. A woman in Montgomery, Alabama, served neck bones over white rice every other Sunday for 30 years. She seasoned them with salt, pepper, onion powder, and a bay leaf, and she let them cook so long the bones practically dissolved. The gravy was the prize. She poured it over everything on the plate. If you were in that kitchen, you remember the windows. Stayed fogged for hours from the steam. Neck bones were survival food that became tradition food that became memory food. Most butcher shops do not even carry them anymore. Here is what that loss means. An entire category of affordable, deeply flavorful cooking has gone quiet, not because it stopped tasting good. Number 14, smothered chicken. Smothering was a technique that belonged to Black Southern kitchens the way braising belonged to French ones. A woman in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, seasoned chicken pieces with a spice blend she kept in a mason jar and dredged them in flour. She fried them golden, then made a gravy in the same skillet using the drippings, more flour, onions, and chicken broth. She put the chicken back in, covered the skillet, and let everything simmer until the chicken was so tender it fell apart when you looked at it. The gravy soaked into the flour coating and the meat, and the result was a dish that tasted like fried chicken, and gravy had merged into a single thing. Nobody measured the broth. Nobody timed the simmer. You watched the gravy and listened to the pan, and when the bubbling slowed to a gentle murmur, the chicken was done. This dish required patience and attention, two things that cannot be written into a recipe. Here is why the cooking by feel tradition disappeared. Grandmothers learned by standing next to their own mothers for years, watching, tasting, adjusting. That apprenticeship happened naturally when families lived close together and Sunday dinner was the center of the week. But when families spread out, when the young moved to cities, when Sunday stopped being a day of rest and became a day of errands, the apprenticeship ended. You could not learn the feel of biscuit dough through a phone call from 3 states away. You could not learn the color of properly seasoned oil through a text message. The knowledge required presence, and presence became a luxury that modern life couldn't afford. Instant mixes and boxed meals filled the gap, but they did not fill the loss. Number 13, red beans and rice. In New Orleans, red beans and rice was the Monday meal, born from the tradition of washing clothes by hand all day while a pot simmered on the back burner. But in Black households across the South, it moved to Sunday because that was when the leftover ham bone became the foundation for the next meal. A woman in Lake Charles, Louisiana, soaked dried kidney beans overnight, then cooked them with that ham bone, an onion, a bell pepper, celery, and garlic until the beans turned creamy and the broth turned thick and smoky. She served it over white rice, and the whole plate cost less than $1. Louis Armstrong loved this dish so much, he signed his personal letters with the phrase, "That was not a joke. That was a man who never forgot where his mama's food came from." The dish required no recipe because the recipe was always the same: beans, pork, Trinity, rice, thyme. Number 11, ham hocks and greens. A smoked ham hock cost 35 cents in 1975 and existed for one purpose: to give flavor to a pot of greens. A woman in rural Mississippi dropped 2 ham hocks into a pot of water at dawn, let them simmer until the broth turned smoky and rich, then added turnip greens she had picked from the garden that morning. She cooked them together for 3 hours until the greens were tender and the meat was falling off the bone. The potlikker, that broth at the bottom, was considered the most nourishing part of the meal. Some women drank it straight from a cup. Others soaked cornbread in it until the bread dissolved. The ham hock was the cheapest cut in the store, but in the right kitchen, it was the most valuable because it made everything it touched taste better. One ham hock flavored an entire pot of greens that fed a family of 8. That math was the whole point. Number 10, black-eyed peas. In the South, black-eyed peas on New Year's Day meant good luck for the coming year. But in a Black kitchen, they appeared on your table almost every Sunday because they were cheap, filling, and cooked themselves. A bag of dried black-eyed peas cost less than $1 and produced enough food for 3 days. A woman in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, simmered them with a smoked ham hock, diced onion, and a can of tomatoes until the beans turned creamy and the broth thickened into something that tasted like the South's entire cooking history in one spoonful. She served them over rice with cornbread on the side. The seasoning was simple: salt, pepper, a bay leaf, and whatever the ham hock gave up during those long hours of cooking. She did not measure any of it. She tasted and adjusted until her tongue said it was right. That tongue was the most accurate measuring instrument in the kitchen. Now, that knowledge lived only inside her body, and when she was gone, it was gone. Number 9, pound cake. This was the dessert that 3 women in one family could not recreate after the one who baked it was gone. A woman in Nashville baked her pound cake every Saturday afternoon so it would be ready for Sunday dinner. The original recipe was simple: a pound of butter, a pound of sugar, a pound of flour, a pound of eggs. But no woman followed that formula exactly. She added a splash of vanilla, a drop of almond extract, a pour of heavy cream she measured by watching the batter change color. She creamed the butter and sugar by hand with a wooden spoon for 20 minutes because she said hand mixing put air into the batter that no electric mixer could replicate. She checked doneness by inserting a broom straw from the kitchen broom, not a toothpick, a broom straw. When it came out clean, the cake was done. That pound cake had a crust on the outside and a dense buttery center that melted on the tongue. Her daughters used the same ingredients, the same oven, and couldn't match it. You could follow every step and still miss the thing that made it right. They did not have her hands. Here is what Sunday dinner really meant. It was not just a meal. It was the one time all week when your entire family sat at the same table. The woman who cooked at the head, children filling every chair, sometimes sitting on overturned buckets dragged from the porch. The food was the reason everyone came, but the gathering was the point. After church, the kitchen became the center of the world. Women who had worked all week in other people's houses came home and cooked in their own. The table they set was proof that this family was together. This family was fed. This family was whole. And when she stopped cooking, the family stopped gathering. Not because people stopped being hungry, but because nobody else could make the food taste right. Number 8, rice pudding. This was the dessert you got when there was leftover rice from Sunday dinner and the woman cooking refused to let a single grain go to waste. She mixed the cold rice with milk, sugar, eggs, vanilla, and a handful of raisins, poured it into a baking dish, and set it in the oven until it became a warm, custardy pudding that tasted like someone had turned a bowl of rice into a hug. A woman in Norfolk, Virginia, made her rice pudding with a sprinkle of cinnamon on top and a dot of butter in the center that melted into a golden pool. She said it had to be eaten warm, straight from the oven, because once it cooled, it wasn't the same. Rice pudding was the quietest dessert on a Sunday table, never as dramatic as sweet potato pie or as showy as pound cake, but it was the one you asked for when you were sick, when you were sad, when you needed comfort without any effort. It didn't ask anything of you except to eat it slowly. Number 7, stewed chicken and dumplings. A woman in rural North Carolina could turn the oldest, toughest hen in the yard into a supper that tasted like love had been simmered into liquid. She boiled the whole chicken with celery, onion, and salt until the meat fell off the bones and the broth turned golden. She pulled the bones out, shredded the meat back in, and dropped spoonfuls of dumpling dough into the bubbling broth. The dumplings were nothing but flour, baking powder, salt, and milk. She dropped them in rough spoonfuls that puffed up in the steam and turned soft and pillowy in 15 minutes. The result was a pot of tender chicken, thick broth, and dumplings that dissolved on the tongue. For generations, this was the meal that showed up on your doorstep when someone was grieving. They didn't bring flowers, They didn't bring cards. They brought chicken and dumplings because food was how they said everything words could not. Number 6, fried catfish. In the Mississippi Delta, Friday was fish fry night, but catfish made its way onto the Sunday table in plenty of black households too. A woman in Greenwood, Mississippi, kept a paper bag of seasoned cornmeal in the pantry at all times. She dredged the catfish fillets through it, shaking off the excess with the flick of her wrist, and lowered them into a skillet of hot oil. The fish fried for 4 minutes on each side, and she knew it was done by the color of the crust and the way the edges curled up from the oil. No timer, no recipe. The seasoned cornmeal bag was refilled by feel. A handful of this, a shake of that, and it came out different every time, but always tasted right. Catfish was cheap. A fisherman uncle or cousin often brought it to the back door still alive in a bucket, and she cleaned it on newspaper spread across the porch. That supply chain's mostly gone now. Number 5, corn pudding. This was the side dish that nobody remembers until someone brings it up, and then you remember it all at once. A woman in the Carolinas mixed cream corn with eggs, milk, sugar, butter, and a spoonful of flour, poured it into a buttered baking dish, and baked it until the top turned golden and the center jiggled when she shook the pan. It set as it cooled into a sweet, custardy side that was half vegetable and half dessert. Nobody could agree on whether it belonged next to the greens or next to the pie. Corn pudding appeared at Sunday dinners across the rural South from the 1940s through the 1980s, and then it stopped showing up. The grandmothers who made it passed away. Their daughters couldn't quite remember the proportions. And because it was never a glamorous dish, nobody thought to ask for the recipe while there was still someone alive who knew it. Too simple to seem important. That's exactly why it disappeared. Number 4, bread pudding. This was the dish that said nothing in this kitchen goes to waste. Stale bread that had sat on your counter for 3 days became a dessert people requested by name. A woman in New Orleans tore day-old French bread into chunks, soaked them in milk, eggs, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon until the bread dissolved into a soft custardy mass. She stirred in raisins and melted butter, pressed it into a baking pan, and baked it until the top turned brown and the center barely set. The whiskey sauce came after, made with butter, powdered sugar, and a heavy pour of bourbon she did not measure and did not apologize for. You made this because you had stale bread and could not afford to throw food away. But necessity produced something so good that restaurants later charged $15 a plate for it. The woman who invented it in her kitchen never saw $1 of that. Number 3, 7-Up cake. This was the Sunday cake that confused everyone who did not grow up in a black household. A woman poured an entire bottle of 7-Up soda into her pound cake batter, and the carbonation made the cake rise higher and lighter than any standard recipe could achieve. The soda added moisture and a subtle lemon-lime sweetness that was impossible to identify unless someone told you the secret. A woman in Jackson, Mississippi made her 7-Up cake in a bundt pan greased with Crisco and poured a lemon-lime glaze over the top while the cake was still warm. Her version was passed down from the woman who raised her, who had been making it since the 1950s. The recipe was always the same: butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and a bottle of 7-Up. But the amounts were never written down. She knew the batter was right by the way it poured off the spoon in a thick, slow ribbon. That visual cue was the recipe. Number 2, pinto beans with ham bone. This was the Saturday night pot that carried over into Sunday dinner. A woman in the Ozarks soaked dried pinto beans overnight, then simmered them all day with a ham bone from the previous week. One meal fed the next. The cycle never ended. She added salt, pepper, and nothing else because the ham bone did all the work. After 8 hours, the beans turned creamy and the broth turned thick and brown, she served them over cornbread made in a cast iron skillet, seasoned by 50 years of use. The cornbread cracked when she flipped it out, and the family broke the day's bread into chunks and soaked them in the bean liquor until the bread went soft. Pinto beans were the cheapest source of protein in the American grocery store in 1960, and they still are. If you kept a bag of pintos and a box of cornmeal in the cupboard, you would never go hungry. There was nothing to photograph. There was only a full table. Number 1, giblet gravy. This was the dish that tied the entire Sunday table together. Giblet gravy was made from the parts of the bird most people threw away: the neck, the heart, the liver, the gizzard. A woman in Columbia, South Carolina, simmered those giblets in salted water while the rest of the meal cooked around her. When the meat was tender, she chopped it fine, made a roux with drippings and flour, and stirred the broth and giblets in until the gravy turned smooth and dark and rich. She poured it over the rice, over the dressing, over the chicken, over Sunday's biscuits. It was the one element that turned separate dishes into a unified dinner. The gravy had no recipe because it depended on whatever bird she was cooking that day and how that day's flour felt between her fingers. Her daughter tried to learn it by watching. Her daughter's daughter tried by asking. Neither got it right. When she passed in 2011, the gravy passed with her. The Sunday table never tasted complete again. Here is my challenge. Make one of these dishes this week, just one. The smothered pork chops, the collard greens, the candied yams. Then sit down at the table, not the couch. Set a place, eat it slow, because these dishes were never just about Sunday. They were about staying together and staying fed when the world made it easy to drift apart. There is a woman somewhere in your family tree who set a table like these women set theirs, who cooked something by feel that nobody else could replicate, who fed people something that tasted like safety. That knowledge does not have to disappear with her. You can be the one who asks before it is too late, who stands in the kitchen long enough to understand the feel of things. Tell me in the comments which dish was made without a recipe in your family. I want to know if the macaroni and cheese gets more love than the fried chicken. I want to know if anyone else had a woman in their kitchen who measured vanilla by counting to 3.
Fried bologna sandwiches were the working family's delicacy, simple yet unforgettable. A slice of bologna hit the skillet with a pop, curling up at the edges as it browned. Some folks cut a small X in the center to keep it flat, while others let it bubble proudly in the middle. The smell was savory, smoky, and enough to draw kids from every corner of the house. Served between 2 slices of white bread with mustard or mayonnaise, it became a warm, satisfying meal. It was the kind of sandwich you could make in minutes after a long day, but it tasted like something far more special. In neighborhoods across the South and city blocks up north, this quick bite became a comfort food that never really left. It was proof that nostalgia could be fried right into a pan and served up with pride. Many added cheese when payday came or a fried egg for extra richness, but even plain, it hit the spot every time. The first bite was always hot and salty, the bread soft and buttery at the edges. It was cheap, sure, but it tasted like victory at the end of a long week. That sizzle in the pan sounded like hope, fast, familiar, and enough to make a whole family smile. Maypop fruit mash turned the wild passion fruit of the American South into a rare dessert filled with tropical fragrance. Known as maypop for the sound of its hollow fruit when stepped on, this native vine produced aromatic yellow fruits that ripened in late summer. Enslaved foragers gathered the fruit, split the rinds, and scooped the bright pulp into a bowl with a drizzle of molasses or honey when such sweeteners were at hand. The result was a naturally tangy treat that needed no cooking and provided a burst of vitamins. The flavor, a cross between citrus and melon, delighted anyone lucky enough to taste it. Even after emancipation, rural families prized maypops for jellies and pies, and the plant remains a cherished wild edible across the Southeast. Maypop fruit mash preserves a memory of fleeting seasonal abundance and the creativity that transformed wild gifts into moments of celebration, proving that even in the harshest circumstances, people found ways to enjoy the bright, unique flavors offered freely by the natural world. Pickled watermelon rind turned summer scraps into something bright and memorable when waste was never an option. Families peeled the green rinds from sweet watermelons, cut them into strips, and simmered them in a brine of vinegar, sugar, and warm spices until the pieces turned translucent and tender. The finished pickles carried a gentle sweetness with a tart kick that balanced fried fish or smoky barbecued pork. Children often helped pack the jars, laughing as the kitchen filled with the scent of cinnamon and clove. These jars lined pantry shelves and cooled in cellars, ready to brighten winter meals with a taste of summer. For many households, this thrifty condiment was a sign of careful planning and pride in making every harvest last. Today, few people bother to save the rinds, and the recipe hides in old notebooks and fading memories. Yet those who remember speak of the surprising pleasure of that sweet, sour crunch beside a plate of fried catfish. Beef and vegetable skillet hash was the solution to vegetables on their last day and bits of leftover meat waiting for a purpose. Everything went into the pan together, sizzling and browning until the kitchen smelled like something hearty and homey. The vegetables softened, the beef crisped around the edges, and the whole skillet turned into a savory patchwork of flavors. It was filling, flexible, and comforting, the kind of meal shaped entirely by what needed to be used up. Kids might pick through it. Adults might appreciate it more, but everyone remembered it. Even now, people crave that skillet hash because it tasted like practicality done right, like the quiet work of making food last without sacrificing comfort. It was a dish that reflected the real rhythm of family life, a meal that came from instinct instead of recipes. You could hear the spatula scraping the pan and know dinner was close. Know something warm and honest was about to land on your plate. It was thrift elevated by experience, and that is why it still lives in so many memories. String beans canned in bulk and seasoned with bacon drippings provided the vegetable side that stretched pennies into portions for crowds, proving preserved vegetables could taste homemade. Black mothers bought cases of canned green beans when on sale, often paying less than 30 cents per can, then transformed them by draining the packing liquid and cooking them down with saved bacon grease. The bacon drippings, carefully stored from breakfast preparations throughout the year, added smoky richness that made even plain canned vegetables taste slow-cooked. Onions sautéed in the drippings first created a flavor base, then the drained beans went into simmer until they softened and absorbed all that porky goodness. Some women added a pinch of sugar to balance saltiness, while others threw in a ham hock if available. The beans weren't crisp tender but cooked until completely soft, the way older generations preferred vegetables. Children usually won over by these bacon-flavored beans. Mashed potato pancakes were the kind of thrifty dinner that made last night's leftovers taste brand new again. Families mixed cold mashed potatoes with a little flour, egg, and seasoning, shaping them into patties that went straight into a hot skillet. As they browned, the edges crisped into a golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, a perfect contrast that made each bite feel special. The smell of frying potatoes curled through the kitchen, bringing everyone to the table before the first batch was even done. These pancakes were filling, inexpensive, and surprisingly fun to eat, especially for kids who loved anything they could pick up with their hands. Adults appreciated the practicality of turning leftovers into something delicious. The dish did not try to impress, but it always delivered comfort. Even today, people crave those warm, crispy pancakes because they carry the memory of simple meals served with quiet pride. They tasted like resourcefulness, familiarity, and the joy of discovering that leftovers could be just as good the second time around. Baked sweet corn casserole made with creamed corn and cornbread mix became the dish that straddled the line between bread and vegetable, providing filling substance that satisfied children and adults. Black mothers would mix canned creamed corn with cornbread mix, eggs, and margarine, creating batter that baked into something between cornbread and corn pudding. The dish was sweet, moist, and substantial, feeling like comfort food rather than plain vegetables. It could be prepared in large pans that fed crowds, and it traveled well to church dinners and family gatherings without falling apart. Children who normally resisted vegetables would eat this because it tasted more like dessert than side dish, while adults valued its ability to fill hungry stomachs inexpensively. The casserole used ingredients that most households kept in pantries, making it possible to whip up even when fresh groceries were scarce. Corn casserole proved that creative combinations could turn basic staples into family traditions. Pinto bean cakes were genius in their simplicity. Leftover beans from last night's pot were mashed, mixed with flour and onions, and fried until golden brown. What had started as scraps became something new, something delicious. The cakes were crisp at the edges and soft in the center, hearty enough to stand on their own or to sit beside rice or greens. It was a meal made by hands that refused to waste, by people who understood that nothing in the kitchen should ever be thrown away. The scent of frying bean cakes was homely and warm, a small reward for hard work. Each bite tasted of thrift, resourcefulness, and quiet pride. It was proof that survival could be creative, and that good cooking never depended on wealth, only wisdom. The sound of the pan crackling was the sound of resilience itself. A sprinkle of salt, a turn of the spatula, and the world felt right again. Served with hot sauce or ketchup, they turned into a feast from the plainest of ingredients. Bean cakes taught children early on that waste was not an option, and that love could be fried up right alongside supper. Hoghead cheese was a triumph of resourcefulness, transforming every part of the animal into a dish of surprising elegance. After a hog was butchered, the head was simmered slowly with onions, herbs, and spices until the meat fell from the bone. The rich broth was strained and cooled, setting into a savory jelly that held tender shreds of meat and subtle seasoning. Sliced and served cold with crackers or bread, it became a delicacy at gatherings where nothing was wasted and flavor was celebrated. Making it required patience and skill, with families sharing techniques that varied from one household to the next. Children watched the slow process with a mix of curiosity and awe, learning that thrift could create unexpected pleasures. Today, few people undertake the labor of hoghead cheese, and store-bought versions lack the character of the homemade original, but its history endures as a testament to resilience and the deep respect African-American cooks held for every gift the animal provided. Fried bologna steaks were the kind of dinner that proved you did not need expensive meat to feel like you were eating something special. Thick-cut slices of bologna hit the pan with a sizzle, curling at the edges as the heat transformed them from simple lunch meat into something smoky, savory, and downright irresistible. Families would score the edges so they stayed flat, pressing them down like a short-order cook working the grill at a busy diner. Once browned and sizzling, those slices went onto a plate beside potatoes or toast, turning an ordinary night into something that tasted hearty and satisfying. The smell drifted through the whole house, warm and salty and impossible to ignore. Kids loved watching the slices puff up. Adults loved how far a single pack could stretch, and everyone loved how it tasted a lot fancier than it actually was. It was thrift done right, the kind that created a meal so memorable you still think about it decades later. No matter how simple the ingredients were, fried bologna steaks felt like real food, the kind of meal that told you everything was going to be okay. Okra stewed with tomatoes became the southern side dish that provided both vegetables and sauce, stretching fresh produce into enough servings for large families without requiring meat. Black mothers would buy okra when it went on sale during late summer and fall, freezing what they couldn't use immediately for Thanksgiving preparations. The okra was sliced and cooked slowly with canned tomatoes, onions, and whatever seasonings the cabinet held, creating thick, flavorful stew. Some people loved okra's distinctive texture, while others needed convincing, but most agreed the tomato sauce made it more palatable. The dish was economical because okra was plentiful and cheap during season, while canned tomatoes cost less than fresh vegetables during winter months. This stew provided vitamins and fiber that balanced heavier, richer dishes on Thanksgiving tables, making it nutritionally important beyond mere economy. Okra and tomatoes represented the kind of practical cooking that sustained Black families.
Because these are not just Sunday dinners. They are proof that the most important recipes were never written down, only carried in hands that knew things no cookbook could teach.